The world stood still on June 25, 2009. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the man who had moonwalked into the hearts of billions, was gone. The news spread like wildfire across every continent, every city, every home. Fans collapsed in the streets. Memorials sprang up overnight outside his Los Angeles mansion. The music had stopped, and humanity wept together in a way it hadn't since the loss of other great legends. But death, especially the death of someone so monumental, so impossibly famous, never comes without questions. And in Michael's case, those questions would soon transform into something far more mysterious than anyone could have imagined. The memorial service held at the Staples Center in Los Angeles was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. 50 million people watched globally as celebrities, family members, and devoted fans gathered to say goodbye. The golden casket sat center stage, gleaming under the lights like a throne fit for royalty. Inside lay the body of a man who had revolutionized music, broken down racial barriers, and created a legacy that would echo through eternity. His daughter Paris spoke through tears, her voice breaking as she called him the best father anyone could imagine. His brothers stood stoic, their faces masks of grief. Janet Jackson clutched tissues, unable to hold back the flood of emotions. The atmosphere was thick with sorrow, but also with something else, an unspoken tension that hung in the air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What nobody knew at that moment, what not even his closest family members could have suspected, was that the truth about Michael Jackson's final resting place would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in entertainment history. The casket that was displayed for the world to see was just the beginning of a story that would take years to fully unfold. Behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the mourning crowds, decisions were being made that would alter the course of how we understood Michael's death and, more importantly, what he left behind for the world to discover. After the public memorial concluded, the casket was transported to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. This wasn't just any cemetery. Forest Lawn had become the final resting place for Hollywood's elite. Walt Disney, Elizabeth Taylor, and countless other legends had found their eternal peace within its sacred grounds. The location chosen for Michael was a great mausoleum, a sprawling marble structure that looked more like a palace than a burial site. Security was unprecedented. Guard patrolled every entrance. Cameras monitored every corridor. The Jackson family had made it abundantly clear that their beloved Michael would rest in absolute privacy, away from the prying eyes of fans and media who had hounded him throughout his entire life. But privacy, as the family would soon learn, came with its own complications. The decision to seal Michael's crypt wasn't made lightly. There were discussions, arguments even, among family members about what was appropriate. Some wanted transparency, believing that Michael's fans deserved to pay their respects in a traditional way. Others insisted on protection, fearing that his grave would become a circus, that people would attempt to disturb his peace for profit or perverse curiosity. In the end, caution won. The crypt was sealed with a thick marble slab, engraved simply with his name and the dates that bookend his remarkable journey through life. What happened next remained hidden from public knowledge for considerable time. The family hired private security teams, not just to guard the exterior of the mausoleum, but to maintain a constant presence inside as well. This level of protection seemed excessive to outsiders, but those close to the situation understood the reality. Michael Jackson wasn't just a celebrity. He was a brand worth billions, a figure so iconic that even in death, people would go to extraordinary lengths to exploit any connection to him. Rumors had already begun circulating about attempted break-ins, about obsessed fans plotting to steal memorabilia from his estate, about shadowy figures offering ridiculous sums of money to cemetery workers for information or access. 3 years passed. The world slowly adjusted to a reality without new Michael Jackson music, without his electrifying performances, without his charitable works making headlines. His estate continued to thrive, releasing posthumous albums and organizing tribute shows that kept his memory alive. But for those who truly loved him, who had grown up with his music as the soundtrack to their lives, there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. Conspiracy theories emerged, as they always do when someone famous dies. Some claimed he had faked his death and was living on a remote island. Others insisted that foul play had been involved, that powerful people had orchestrated his demise. The truth, whatever it was, seemed destined to remain buried with him. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a routine inspection, something required by California state law for all sealed crypts after a certain period. The Jackson family had been notified months in advance, but they had delayed the process repeatedly, citing emotional distress and the need for privacy. Finally, under legal pressure, they agreed to allow cemetery officials to perform the mandatory examination. The date was set. A small team was assembled: cemetery administrators, a representative from the county, and 2 members of the Jackson family who had volunteered to be present. Nobody expected anything unusual. This was supposed to be a simple verification that the crypt remained structurally sound and that no environmental issues had compromised the burial site. The marble slab was carefully removed early one morning before the cemetery opened to visitors. The air inside was stale and cool, preserved by the sealed environment. As the team prepared to document the interior condition of the crypt, one of the officials noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Resting on top of the casket, clearly placed there after the burial, was a sealed metal box. The metal box gleamed dully in the flashlight beams, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested it had been there for years, yet its presence was impossible to explain through any official record. The cemetery administrators exchanged confused glances. The Jackson family representatives froze, their faces draining of color. This wasn't part of the original burial arrangement. No documentation existed for any additional items being placed inside the sealed crypt after the funeral. The box itself was unremarkable in design, approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 6 inches deep. It appeared to be made of brushed steel, with no visible lock, just a simple latch mechanism that had been secured with what looked like red wax bearing an imprint that none of them could immediately identify. The senior cemetery official, a man named Harold Winters, who had worked at Forest Lawn for 37 years and thought he had seen everything, stepped forward with trembling hands. He had overseen the burials of countless celebrities, had dealt with family dramas and media frenzies, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for this moment. The protocol for such a discovery was murky at best. Should they open it immediately? Should they call the police? The box could contain anything: personal effect that a family member had secretly placed there, or something far more concerning. The tension in that cool marble chamber became suffocating as everyone present realized they were standing at the threshold of something that could either be deeply personal or explosively controversial. One of the Jackson family members present was Tito Jackson's eldest son, TJ, who had been appointed as co-guardian of Michael's children after his death. TJ had grown up in the shadow of his legendary uncle, had seen both the magnificent heights and the devastating lows of Michael's existence. He stepped closer to the box, his voice barely above a whisper as he said what everyone was thinking. "We need to know what's inside." Uncle Michael wouldn't have wanted secrets. He lived under suspicion his whole life. "Whatever this is, we face it together." His words carried weight. The others nodded in agreement, though the fear in their eyes remained evident. Harold Winters pulled on a fresh pair of white cotton gloves, the kind used for handling delicate historical documents. He approached the box with the reverence of an archaeologist opening an ancient tomb. The latch resisted at first, the wax seal cracking and crumbling as he applied gentle pressure. Then, with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber like a gunshot, the box opened. Inside, nestled in layers of protective cloth, were items that would take days to fully catalog and understand. But 3 things were immediately visible, and they struck everyone present with the force of a physical blow. The first item was a leather-bound journal, thick and worn, with Michael's name embossed in gold on the cover. The edges of the pages were yellow with age, and slips of paper marked various sections throughout. TJ lifted it carefully, his hand shaking as he recognized his uncle's distinctive handwriting on the first page. The entry was dated just 2 weeks before Michael's death. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I'm gone, and it's time for the truth to finally emerge from the shadows where I've kept it hidden all these years. What I'm about to reveal will shock the world, will make people question everything they thought they knew about me, about my life, about the music industry itself. But I can't take these secrets to my grave. They are too important. They affect too many people." The second item was a collection of what appeared to be legal documents, contracts, and correspondence between Michael and various record executives, lawyers, and business partners. Even a cursory glance revealed names that were instantly recognizable, moguls who had shaped the entertainment industry for decades, power brokers whose influence extended far beyond music into politics, finance, and media. The documents were marked with Michael's annotations, highlighted sections, and handwritten notes in the margins that suggested he had been building a case, gathering evidence for some purpose that had never been fulfilled during his lifetime. The third item was perhaps the most visually striking, a collection of cassette tapes, dozens of them, each labeled in Michael's meticulous handwriting with dates and cryptic titles. The Truth About Chandler, one read. What Really Happened in Neverland, said another. The People Who Betrayed Me, stated a third. These weren't professionally produced recordings. They were personal audio diaries, Michael's own voice preserved on magnetic tape, waiting to be heard. The implications were staggering. These tapes could contain confessions, accusations, revelations that would rewrite the narrative of Michael Jackson's life and career. But there was something else in the box, something that lay beneath all the documents and tapes, wrapped separately in black velvet cloth. Harold Winters lifted it with even greater care than he had shown the journal. As he unwrapped it, a collective gasp filled the chamber. It was a mask, not just any mask, but one that looked eerily similar to the ones Michael had worn during his later years when appearing in public. But this mask was different. It was made of what appeared to be medical-grade silicone, with such incredible detail and craftsmanship that it looked disturbingly realistic. Attached to it was a handwritten note on yellow paper. The message was brief but loaded with meaning. The face the world saw wasn't always mine. Sometimes we must hide our true selves to survive. Look deeper. Question everything. The room fell into stunned silence. Each person present understood they had stumbled upon something far beyond a simple collection of personal effects. This was evidence of something larger, something that Michael Jackson had deliberately preserved and hidden, intending for it to be discovered after his death. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but present in everyone's mind, was terrifying in its implications. If Michael had gone to such lengths to hide this box, to ensure it would only be found under specific circumstances, what other secret had he taken to his grave? And more importantly, who else knew about this box? Who had helped him place it there after the burial, breaking into a sealed crypt to leave these items behind? T.J. Jackson pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to decide who to call first. The family needed to know. The estate's lawyers needed to be informed. But there was also the media to consider. If word of this discovery leaked before they understood its full implications, the feeding frenzy would be unstoppable. Every tabloid, every news network, every social media platform would explode with speculation. Michael's children would be dragged back into the spotlight they had worked so hard to escape. The carefully constructed peace that had settled over the Jackson family in recent years would shatter like glass. Harold Winters made a decision that would define the next chapter of this unfolding mystery. He closed the box and turned to everyone present. Nothing we've seen here leaves this room until the family decides how to proceed. I'm sealing this chamber again, and we're all going to sign confidentiality agreements. Whatever Michael Jackson wanted the world to know, it should be revealed on the family's terms, not through leaked photos or stolen documents. Everyone agreed, though they all knew that keeping such an explosive secret would be nearly impossible. Someone would talk. Someone always talked. The clock was ticking. 3 days after the discovery, the Jackson family gathered at Catherine Jackson's home in Calabasas, the same house where Michael had spent his final weeks, where his children still visited their grandmother regularly. The atmosphere was tense beyond measure. Family members who hadn't spoken in years sat side by side, united by the magnitude of what had been found. The metal box sat on the dining room table like a bomb waiting to explode. Catherine, now in her mid-80s but still sharp and commanding, sat at the head of the table. Her hands were folded in prayer position, her eyes closed as she gathered the strength to face whatever truths her son had left behind. The family had agreed that they would go through everything together before making any decisions about what to do with the information. TJ had brought the box directly from Forest Lawn under armed security. The lawyers of Michael's estate were present, along with a private investigator the family had hired to help them understand the legal implications of whatever they might find. Everyone signed the confidentiality agreements. Phones were collected and locked in a safe. What happened in this room would stay in this room until they all agreed otherwise. Catherine Jackson opened her eyes and nodded to TJ. He opened the box for the second time and carefully removed the leather-bound journal. The weight of it in his hands felt like holding the truth itself, heavy and undeniable. He began to read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. The first entry took everyone's breath away. Michael wrote about the loneliness of fame, about feeling like a prisoner in his own life, watched constantly, judged relentlessly, misunderstood on a level that caused him physical pain. But these weren't just the musings of a sad celebrity. There were detailed observations about how the entertainment industry operated, how artists were controlled and exploited, how power was wielded by people the public never saw. As TJ continued reading, the entries became more specific and far more disturbing. Michael wrote about his suspicions that his phones were tapped, that his homes were under surveillance by parties unknown. He documented conversations with other artists who had tried to warn him about the dangers of owning his own masters, of having too much creative control, of becoming too powerful. He named names, producers who had threatened him, executives who had attempted to sabotage his projects, influential figures who he believed wanted him silenced or discredited. The paranoia that many had dismissed as eccentricity suddenly seemed far more justified. One entry, dated just 6 months before his death, contained information that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Michael wrote about meeting with an investigative journalist who specialized in exposing corruption in the music industry. He had begun sharing documentation about questionable business practices, about contracts that amounted to modern-day servitude, about accounting irregularities that suggested massive financial fraud. The journalist, whose name Michael had redacted in the journal, had been helping him organize evidence for a potential lawsuit that would target multiple major entertainment corporations. But the entry ended with an ominous note. "I'm scared. Really scared. The journalist called me yesterday and said she's being followed. She wants to back out. But I can't stop now. Too many artists are suffering. If something happens to me, this journal is a proof that I didn't just give up on this fight." The room erupted into overlapping voices, shock, anger, disbelief, and fear competing for dominance. La Toya Jackson, who had long claimed that her brother was murdered despite public skepticism, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "I told everyone," she shouted. "I told you all that something wasn't right about his death, and everyone thought I was crazy." The lawyers were frantically taking notes, already calculating the legal ramifications of what they were hearing. If Michael Jackson's journal suggested foul play, if he had been building a case against powerful entities in the entertainment world, then his death needed to be reinvestigated with a completely different lens. But the journal contained more than just accusations about the music industry. There were deeply personal entries about his children, how much he loved them, how he tried to protect them from the cruelty he had experienced, how he feared for their future if anything happened to him. He wrote about his own childhood, about the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his father Joe, about the psychological damage that had never fully healed despite years of therapy. These entries were heartbreaking in their honesty, revealing a side of Michael Jackson that even his family hadn't fully understood. He wrote about his struggles with prescription medication, about the chronic pain he suffered from years of dancing, about the insomnia that plagued him and made sleep impossible without chemical help. One particularly devastating entry addressed the allegations of child abuse that had shadowed the final decades of his life. Michael wrote with raw emotion about how those accusations had destroyed him, how the mere suggestion that he could harm a child made him physically ill, how he had considered suicide multiple times because he couldn't bear the stain on his reputation. He detailed the extortion attempts, the lawyers who had advised him to settle cases rather than face trial, the media circus that had presumed his guilt without evidence. He wrote about the children who had accused him, expressing not anger but sadness that they had been put in positions where they felt they needed to lie, manipulated by adults seeking money. He maintained his innocence with conviction that leaped off the page, but he also acknowledged that the court of public opinion had already convicted him, and that nothing he could say would ever fully restore his name. The family sat in silence as TJ finished reading the final entry in the journal. It was dated June 23, 2009, just 2 days before Michael's death. The entry was short, almost peaceful in tone compared to the turmoil of earlier pages. "I'm tired," Michael wrote. "So tired of fighting, of defending myself, of trying to prove my worth to a world that has already decided who I am. But I'm also at peace because I know the truth. I know what's in my heart. And now, with this journal and everything I've gathered, the truth will survive me. My children will know. The world will know. And maybe, just maybe, things will change for the artists who come after me. If I've done nothing else with this strange, painful, beautiful life, let it be that I told the truth when it mattered most." Katherine Jackson wiped tears from her weathered face and reached for the box. Her hands were steadier than anyone expected as she removed the stack of legal documents. These would require expert analysis, but even a preliminary review revealed explosive information. There were contracts showing how Michael's catalog, including the Beatles songs he famously owned, had become the center of intense corporate battles. There were letters from lawyers warning him about threats to his life if he didn't cooperate with certain business demands. There were financial statements showing irregularities in how his tours were managed and how money was distributed. It was a paper trail of an industry that chewed up even its greatest stars and spit them out when they became inconvenient. The cassette tapes remained in the box, dozens of Michael's voice waiting to be heard from beyond the grave. The family decided they would listen to them later, after they had time to process what the journal had already revealed. But everyone present understood that those tapes likely contained even more shocking revelations, personal testimonies that would either vindicate Michael completely or complicate his legacy further. The truth, whatever it was, demanded to be heard. The question now wasn't whether to reveal what they had found. It was how to do it in a way that would honor Michael's memory while protecting his children from further trauma. As the meeting concluded and family members prepared to leave, each person sworn to secrecy until they could formulate a plan. Nobody noticed a small detail that would later prove significant. The mask that had been wrapped in black velvet, the one with a disturbing note attached, had been removed from the box and was now missing. Someone had taken it, but who, and for what purpose, wouldn't become clear until much later. The decision to listen to the cassette tapes was postponed for nearly a week. The emotional toll of reading Michael's journal had been devastating for the family. Katherine Jackson spent 3 days in bed, refusing food and barely speaking. Paris, Michael's daughter, now a young woman trying to build her own life away from her father's shadow, demanded to be present when the tapes were played despite the family's initial resistance. She had spent years wondering about the father she lost too soon, and she wasn't going to let adults make decisions about her right to know the truth. Prince and Blanket, Michael's sons, were more reluctant, afraid of what they might hear, but they ultimately agreed to attend as well. The family reconvened at the same house, this time with professional audio restoration specialists who had been carefully vetted and forced to sign legal documents that would destroy his career if he ever spoke about what he heard. The man brought professional equipment to ensure the old cassette tapes, which had degraded over time, could be played with maximum clarity. He set up in Katherine's living room, a space that had once been filled with Michael's laughter during family gatherings, now transformed into a makeshift studio where the dead would speak. The first tape was labeled The Beginning, 1982. The specialist threaded it carefully into a restored vintage cassette player, adjusted his levels, and pressed play. Static crackled through the speakers, and then Michael's voice emerged, younger and fuller than in his later years, instantly recognizable yet somehow more vulnerable than anyone had ever heard it in public. "This is the first of what I hope will be many recordings," he began. "I'm starting this because I need to remember. I need to document what's happening to me, to my career, to my life, because I have a feeling that one day people will try to rewrite my story. They'll say I was crazy, that I was paranoid, that I brought everything on myself. But I want the truth preserved in my own voice." What followed was a chronological audio diary spanning nearly 3 decades of Michael Jackson's life. The early tapes focus on his experiences during the Thriller era, when he became the biggest star on the planet. But instead of celebrating his success, Michael talked about the pressure, the isolation, the people who suddenly wanted pieces of him. He described meetings where executives talked about him like he was a product rather than a person, where his creative input was dismissed or overridden by people who cared only about profit margins. He talked about the moment he realized he had become a prisoner of his own fame, unable to go anywhere or do anything without causing chaos, his humanity stripped away until he felt like nothing more than an image to be bought and sold. The middle tapes, spanning the 1990s and early 2000s, were harder to listen to. Michael's voice had changed, becoming higher and more fragile, sometimes slurring slightly in ways that suggested he was recording under the influence of pain medication. These tapes addressed the allegations that had destroyed his reputation. Michael spoke with heartbreaking detail about the families who had befriended him, the children he had genuinely tried to help, and the moment those relationships were weaponized against him. He played recordings of phone conversations, evidence he had kept but never released, that showed parents coaching their children on what to say, lawyers discussing settlement amounts before any formal accusations were made. The manipulation was obvious, the extortion blatant, but Michael explained why he had chosen to settle rather than fight in court. "I couldn't put these children through a trial," he said, his voice breaking. "Even if they were lying, even if they were being used by their parents, they were still children, and the media would have destroyed all of us." Paris Jackson sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face as she listened to her father's voice defending himself from beyond the grave. Prince held his grandmother's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Blanket stared at the audio equipment as if he could will it to stop revealing such painful truths. The family lawyers listened with growing alarm, realizing that these tapes could be used to reopen cases, to demand investigations into people who had accused Michael, potentially exposing a pattern of false allegations and extortion that the justice system had never fully addressed. But the most explosive content was on the tapes labeled with specific names, entertainment industry figures, some dead, some still powerful and active. Michael spoke about meetings that had gone wrong, about threats that had been made against him when he refused to comply with demands. He talked about a pattern he had observed over decades. Artists who challenged the system tended to die young or have their careers mysteriously destroyed. He mentioned Prince, who he described as a fellow warrior against industry exploitation. He mentioned Tupac and Biggie, whose murders he believed were connected to their growing power and influence. He even spoke about Whitney Houston, expressing fear that a knowledge of industry secrets made her a target. One tape, dated just 3 months before his death, contained information that made everyone in the room go cold. Michael described a meeting with his physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, where he had caught Murray on the phone having a conversation that didn't sit right. Michael couldn't hear the entire exchange, but he heard Murray say something about making sure the insurance covers everything, and they are prepared to handle the aftermath. Michael said on the tape that he had started to wonder if his doctor was being influenced by outside parties, if the medication he was being given was part of something larger. "I think they want me out of the way," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm too expensive to keep alive. The insurance payout would be worth more to them than anything I could create in the future. I sound paranoid. I know I do. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts are screaming that I'm in danger." The room erupted. La Toya Jackson stood up and began pacing, vindicated but furious. "This is evidence," she shouted. "This is proof that Michael knew something was wrong. We have to go to the police. We have to reopen the investigation into his death." The lawyers were already making calls, contacting criminal defense attorneys, discussing the legal pathways for presenting this evidence to authorities. Dr. Conrad Murray had been convicted of involuntary manslaughter in Michael's death, but he had served only 2 years in prison, a sentence that had always seemed inadequate given that the King of Pop was dead. If Michael's tape suggested a larger conspiracy, if his death was premeditated rather than an accident of medical negligence, then justice had not been served. But there was resistance within the family, too. Some members feared that reopening the case would bring back all the media attention they had worked so hard to escape. Michael's children would be thrust back into the spotlight, forced to relive their father's death in graphic detail. The Jackson name, which had finally begun to recover from years of scandal, would be dragged through the mud again, and there was no guarantee that any investigation would lead to convictions. The people Michael had named were powerful, connected, and wealthy enough to bury the truth under mountains of legal maneuvering. The final tape was labeled simply "For My Children." The audio specialist looked to Catherine for permission before playing it. She nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. Michael's voice came through the speakers, softer now, full of a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the anger and fear in the previous recordings. "Paris, Prince, Blanket, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone. I want you to know that every single day with you was a gift. You were the reason I kept fighting when I wanted to give up. You made me believe in love again, in goodness, in the possibility that maybe I could protect someone from the pain I experienced. Don't let the world define who you are. Don't let them make you ashamed of being my children. I made mistakes. I had problems. But I loved you with everything I had. And I hope that when you're old enough to understand everything, you'll remember that I tried to leave you the truth. Use it wisely. Use it to help others. And please, please forgive me for leaving you too soon." The tape ended. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of crying. Paris Jackson stood up and walked over to the cassette player. She placed her hand on it gently, as if touching her father one last time. "We have to release everything," she said quietly but firmly. "The journal, the documents, these tapes. All of it. Dad spent his whole life being misunderstood. This is his chance to finally tell his own story. We can't keep it hidden because we're afraid." He wasn't afraid. Not at the end. The family looked at each other, the weight of Paris's words settling over them like a blanket. She was right. Michael had left these items specifically to be found, to be shared. He had taken enormous risks to preserve this truth. The question was no longer whether to reveal what they had discovered. It was how to do it in a way that would honor his intentions while preparing for the storm that would inevitably follow. 6 months of preparation followed that fateful day in Katherine Jackson's living room. The family assembled a team of lawyers, publicists, investigators, and media experts to help them navigate the release of Michael's posthumous testimony. They had the journal professionally authenticated, confirming the handwriting and aging of the paper. The cassette tapes were analyzed by audio forensic specialists who verified that the voice was indeed Michael Jackson's and that the recordings had not been tampered with or altered. The legal documents were reviewed by multiple law firms, each confirming that the contracts and correspondence appeared legitimate. The family was building an ironclad case, knowing that the moment they went public, every detail would be questioned and attacked by those with something to lose. The decision was made to release the information through a documentary, giving context and allowing Michael to speak in his own voice rather than having his words filtered through media interpretation. A respected filmmaker who had previously worked on sensitive subjects was brought in, sworn to secrecy, and given access to everything. The documentary will be divided into sections: Michael's creative journey, the business betrayals, the false allegations, his concerns about his own safety, and finally his message to his children and to future artists. It would be unflinching in its honesty, showing Michael's struggles with addiction and his emotional fragility, but it would also demonstrate the systematic exploitation and manipulation that had contributed to his downfall. Meanwhile, the family's private investigator had been digging deeper into the names Michael had mentioned in his tapes. What he uncovered was staggering. Several of the executives Michael had accused of threatening him had been subjects of other artist complaints over the years, but those complaints had been quietly settled or buried. There was a pattern of creative artists losing control of their work, being driven into debt despite massive album sales, and suffering mysterious health crises at moments when they were becoming too independent or too vocal about industry practices. The investigator found connections between various parties that suggested an informal network of power brokers who worked together to maintain control over the most profitable artists in the world. One discovery proved particularly explosive. The investigator tracked down the journalist Michael had mentioned in his journal, the one he had been working with before his death. She was living under a different name in a small town in Oregon, having fled Los Angeles after receiving death threats. When approached by the investigator, she initially refused to talk, but when shown excerpts from Michael's journal and told about the tapes, she broke down. She confirmed everything. She still had copies of the documentation Michael had given her, files she had kept hidden for years out of fear for her safety. She agreed to go on camera for the documentary, to corroborate Michael's claims and provide additional evidence of the corruption he had been trying to expose. As word began to leak that the Jackson family was preparing a major revelation about Michael's life and death, the pressure intensified. The family started receiving calls from lawyers representing various entertainment companies, offering money to suppress the information, threatening lawsuits if any false accusations were made, suggesting that releasing the material would be disrespectful to Michael's memory. Some family members received personal threats, vague warnings about what might happen if they proceeded. Security around Katherine Jackson's home was increased. Paris, Prince, and Blanket were assigned bodyguards. The family had expected resistance, but the intensity of it confirmed what Michael had written in his journal. There were powerful people who desperately did not want this information public. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival on January 25, 2013, nearly 4 years after Michael's death. The Jackson family attended en masse, a united front facing the world together. The screening was held in the festival's largest venue, filled to capacity with journalists, filmmakers, industry professionals, and devoted Michael Jackson fans who had somehow secured tickets. Security was unprecedented. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and tension. For 2 hours and 43 minutes, the audience sat in stunned silence as Michael Jackson spoke from beyond the grave. His voice filled the theater, chronicling a life of unprecedented achievement shadowed by systematic abuse and exploitation. The journal entries were displayed on screen while actors read them. The cassette recordings played over photos and video footage that illustrated what Michael was describing. The legal documents were shown in detail, the implications explained by legal experts, and the evidence of extortion attempts and false allegations was presented with damning clarity, backed by phone recordings and documentation that Michael had secretly preserved. When the documentary ended, the audience sat frozen for several seconds before erupting into a standing ovation that lasted over 10 minutes. Journalists rushed out to file stories. Social media exploded with reactions. Within hours, Michael Jackson was trending worldwide as the documentary's revelation spread across the internet like wildfire. The response was overwhelming: shock, anger, vindication, and renewed love for an artist who had suffered so much while giving so much to the world. But the real impact came in the days and weeks that followed. Artists began speaking out, sharing their own experiences of exploitation and manipulation in the entertainment industry. Several came forward to confirm details Michael had mentioned in his tapes, adding credibility to his most serious accusations. Calls for investigations intensified, not just into Michael's death but into the business practices that had enabled decades of abuse. The documentarian had been careful to present evidence rather than make direct accusations of murder, but the implications were clear enough that prosecutors in Los Angeles announced they would review the case. The legal battle that ensued was massive and complex. Some of the companies and individuals named in Michael's documentation filed defamation lawsuits against the estate, but those lawsuits crumbled when faced with the overwhelming evidence Michael had left behind. Countersuits were filed by Michael's estate, seeking damages for the years of exploitation and emotional distress he had suffered. Some cases settled quietly, with confidential agreements and substantial payouts. Others went to trial, exposing even more corruption and leading to criminal charges against several executives for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Dr. Conrad Murray's conviction was reopened and reviewed in light of the new evidence. While prosecutors ultimately concluded they couldn't prove conspiracy to commit murder beyond a reasonable doubt, Michael's tapes created enough doubt about Murray's actions that he faced additional civil suits from the Jackson estate. More importantly, the medical bar conducted new investigations that revealed Murray had been receiving payments from third parties during the time he was treating Michael, payments that had never been disclosed and which raised serious questions about his motivations and loyalties. The mask, the mysterious item that had disappeared from Katherine Jackson's home during that first family meeting, resurfaced in the most unexpected way. It was delivered anonymously to a major news network with a note written in handwriting that matched Michael's style. The note explained that the mask had been created by a Hollywood special effects artist, someone Michael had commissioned to make realistic facial prosthetics that he could wear when he needed to go out in public without being recognized. The revelation was stunning but also heartbreaking. It confirmed what many had suspected, that Michael Jackson had been so desperate for normalcy, so suffocated by his fame, that he had literally worn a different face just to experience basic human activities like shopping or walking in a park without being mobbed. The special effects artist came forward after the mask's appearance, confirming the story and providing photographs of other disguises he had created for Michael over the years. He described Michael as a prisoner of his own celebrity, someone who longed for the simple pleasures that ordinary people took for granted. The artist had created several different masks and personas, allowing Michael to occasionally slip away from his handlers and security and just exist as a normal person for a few precious hours. The revelation added another layer of tragedy to Michael's story. Even his face, the one thing that should have been unchangeably his own, had become something he felt he needed to hide. Paris Jackson gave her first major interview following the documentary's release, sitting down with a respected journalist to talk about what she had learned about her father through the discovered materials. She was poised and articulate, displaying a maturity beyond her years as she discussed the complicated legacy she had inherited. "My dad was an extraordinary human being who was treated in ordinary, cruel ways," she said. "The world loved his music but didn't love him. They consumed his art but destroyed his spirit. What we found in that box, the journal, the tapes, the evidence, it's proof that he never stopped fighting for truth even when that fight was killing him. I'm proud to be his daughter, and I'm committed to making sure his real story is told, not the distorted version that sold tabloids. The documentary sparked a broader cultural conversation about how society treats its artists and celebrities. Mental health professionals weighed in on the psychological toll of living under constant scrutiny. Legal experts discussed the need for reforms in entertainment contracts and artist rights. Other musicians began sharing their own struggles with industry exploitation, creating a movement that would eventually lead to significant changes in how recording contracts were structured and how artists were compensated for their work. Michael Jackson, in death, had accomplished what he had struggled to achieve in life. He had forced the entertainment industry to confront its own cruelty and corruption. The financial impact on Michael's estate was substantial. The lawsuits and settlements brought in hundreds of millions of dollars, money that was placed in trust for his children and designated for the charitable causes Michael had supported during his life. His album sales surged as a new generation discovered his music in the context of his now documented struggles. The Neverland Ranch, which had been left to deteriorate after his death, was purchased by a consortium of investors who transformed it into a museum and educational center about artistic freedom and the dangers of exploitation. School children toured the property, learning not just about Michael Jackson, performer, but about Michael Jackson, the human being who had fought against injustice until his final breath. But perhaps the most significant outcome was personal rather than public. Michael's 3 children, Paris, Prince, and Blanket, were able to reclaim their father's narrative. They had grown up with a complicated relationship to his legacy, loving him fiercely while also carrying the burden of all the accusations and controversies that had surrounded him. The contents of that metal box gave them something precious: context. They could understand now why their father had been the way he was, why he had been so overprotective, why he had sometimes seemed paranoid or fearful. He hadn't been crazy. He had been responding rationally to real threats, real betrayals, real dangers that had ultimately cost him his life. Years after the documentary's release, as the legal battles wound down and the media frenzy finally subsided, Katherine Jackson sat in her garden on a quiet afternoon, watching her grandchildren play. Paris was there with her own child now, a beautiful little girl who would grow up knowing her grandfather only through stories and music. Prince was pursuing a career in filmmaking, creating documentaries about social justice issues, clearly inspired by his father's posthumous testimony. Blanket, now going by his given name Guy, was studying business with the goal of helping artists avoid the exploitation his father had suffered. Catherine thought about that day in the mausoleum, when the metal box had first been discovered sitting on Michael's casket. She thought about all the pain those revelations had caused, all the wounds they had reopened, all the battles they had forced the family to fight. But she also thought about the peace that had come with truth. Michael had always told her that lies were heavy, that carrying secrets was like wearing chains. By leaving behind his testimony, by ensuring the truth would eventually emerge, he had freed not just himself but everyone who loved him from the burden of unanswered questions and undefended accusations. The mystery of what was found inside Michael Jackson's coffin, or more accurately, what was found resting upon it, had shocked the world. But the real shock wasn't in the discovery itself. It was in the recognition of how much one man had endured, how hard he had fought, and how even in death he had found a way to continue his mission of exposing injustice and protecting those who would come after him. The metal box hadn't contained treasures in the traditional sense. It had contained something far more valuable, the unvarnished truth, preserved in Michael's own words and voice, waiting patiently to be discovered when the time was right. As the sun set over Catherine's garden, casting long shadows across the grass where Michael's grandchildren played, she whispered a prayer of thanks. Her son had suffered immensely, had died too young under circumstances that still cause her pain. But he had not been silenced. His voice still echoed, still influenced, still inspired. The legacy he had fought so hard to protect was secure, not because of the music he had created, though that would live forever, but because he had the courage to tell the truth even when the truth was dangerous. The contents of the metal box had indeed left fans in total shock. But once the shock faded, what remained was something more powerful: understanding, compassion, and a determination to ensure that no other artist would suffer the way Michael Jackson had suffered. That, perhaps, was the greatest gift he could have left behind. His death had been a tragedy, but through the evidence he had so carefully preserved, that tragedy had become a catalyst for change. The King of Pop had one final performance, one last world tour, delivered not from a stage but from beyond the grave, and its impact would resonate for generations to come. The box had been opened, the secrets had been revealed, and the world would never look at Michael Jackson or the entertainment industry the same way again.